The Black Panthers, how America's first black tank battalion fought 2 wars at once. The 761st Tank Battalion fought 2 wars during World War II. The first war was the one history books usually describe, a brutal mechanical struggle against Nazi Germany, fought with steel and fire. Sherman tanks clawed their way through mud and snow. Artillery shook the ground. Infantry and armor moved together through villages reduced to rubble. It was a war measured in miles gained, enemy tanks destroyed, and days survived. The Second War was quieter, slower, and far more exhausting. It was a war against doubt, a war against assumptions made before a single shot was fired, a war against their own country's belief that black Americans could not be trusted with modern weapons, complex machinery, or independent combat roles. That Second War began long before the 761st ever reached Europe, and it did not end when the shooting stopped. When these soldiers finally entered combat in November 1944, they were not untested men. They were veterans of 2 years of scrutiny, delay, and deliberate hesitation. For 24 months they trained while white units shipped out ahead of them. They trained while commanders debated whether they should even exist as a tank battalion. They trained knowing that any mistake, any mechanical failure, any tactical error, would not be judged as an individual failure, but as proof of a racist assumption. They were not allowed the luxury of being average. They had to be perfect, and even then, perfection offered no guarantee of respect. Their story matters not because it has a clean or satisfying ending, it doesn't, but because it reveals something fundamental about sacrifice. These men fought knowing that courage might not be rewarded. They fought knowing that bravery might be ignored. They fought knowing that when they returned home, the uniform that protected them in Europe would not protect them from segregation, discrimination, or violence. They fought anyway. This is the story of how the 761st Tank Battalion earned the nickname Black Panthers through 183 consecutive days of frontline combat, one of the longest continuous combat records of any American tank unit in the war. From the freezing mud of France, through the collapsing defenses of the German heartland, to the gates of concentration camps in Austria, they fought without rest, without rotation, and often without recognition. It is also the story of silence, of why their victories were written small, if at all, of why their casualties were accepted, but their achievements questioned, of why their sergeant, Reuben Rivers, who gave his life repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to save his comrades, did not receive the Medal of Honor until 53 years after he died earning it. And to understand why that delay happened, why heroism could be seen and still denied, we cannot begin on the battlefields of Europe. We have to start earlier. We have to start in the dusty training grounds of Texas, where the 761 learned that before they could fight Hitler's army, they would have to fight an idea, the idea that they did not belong. There, under the southern sun, surrounded by signs that reminded them daily of their place in American society, the men of the 761 discovered a hard truth. Their first enemy wore no uniform. Their first battlefield had no front line. Their first war was against doubt itself. Fort Hood, Texas, training in a segregated army. The men who would become the Black Panthers began their military service at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, in 1942. On paper, it was a standard training location. In reality, it was where the contradiction of their service first became clear. They were training for a war that the army was not yet willing to let them fight. From Claiborne, the battalion was transferred to Fort Hood, Texas, one of the Army's primary centers for armored warfare training. There, the men of the 761 entered a world of steel, engines, and precision. They learned to crew the M4 Sherman tank, not as individuals but as teams. Gunner, loader, driver, commander. Each role depended on the others. One mistake could kill everyone inside. For 2 years, they trained intensively. Live-fire gunnery, tactical maneuvers, coordination with infantry and artillery, night driving, maintenance under pressure. Training reports showed consistent improvement, then excellence. By every measurable standard, accuracy, reaction time, unit cohesion, the battalion met or exceeded expectations. And yet they stayed. While white tank battalions with comparable, or in some cases clearly less, training were sent overseas, the 761 remained stateside. Month after month, season after season. Rumors spread. Dates came and went. Equipment was inspected, reissued, inspected again. The delay had nothing to do with readiness. The army knew they were ready. The reason was institutional prejudice. The United States Army of World War II was rigidly segregated, not as a social accident, but as formal policy. Black soldiers were overwhelmingly assigned to labor and support roles. Truck drivers moving supplies, cooks feeding troops, engineers digging roads, handlers loading ammunition. These jobs were essential, but they were also invisible. Combat, especially mechanized combat, was considered the domain of white soldiers. The prevailing doctrine of the time claimed that black men lacked the technical aptitude required for complex machinery and the discipline necessary for independent combat units. These ideas were not fringe opinions. They were taught. They were written into evaluations. They shaped promotions, assignments, and deployments. In this system, the 761st Tank Battalion was an experiment many senior officers did not want to succeed. Their commanders understood this. Whether driven by fairness, pride, or simple realism, they pushed the battalion harder than comparable white units. Training schedules were tighter. Mistakes were punished more severely. Standards were unforgiving. The unspoken rule was clear. If a white soldier made a mistake, it was an individual failure. If a black soldier made a mistake, it would be remembered as proof. Every cracked track, every misfired round, every delayed maneuver. Nothing could be ordinary. Nothing could be excused. But the pressure did not end when training hours were over. Texas in the 1940s enforced Jim Crow segregation with ruthless consistency. For the men of the 761 SET, daily life off base became a reminder of how their country truly saw them. They wore the same uniform as other American soldiers. They trained for the same war. They were expected to die for the same flag. Yet they could not eat at restaurants that served white customers. They were turned away from stores. They were forced to sit in separate sections of buses, or not ride at all. Some were threatened for wearing their uniforms in certain towns. Others were assaulted. A few learned quickly which roads to avoid after dark. The bitterest irony came in the treatment of German prisoners of war. Captured soldiers who had fought for Nazi Germany, men who served a regime built on racial supremacy, were sometimes allowed into establishments that barred black American soldiers. In some towns, POWs could sit at lunch counters while the men guarding them were told to leave. The message was unmistakable. Enemy soldiers were granted privileges that American citizens in uniform were denied. The men of the 761st saw this contradiction every day. They rarely spoke of it openly, but it shaped everything. Some channeled their anger into discipline, becoming so technically proficient that no one could deny their skill. Others carried quieter questions about loyalty, about belonging, about whether a nation that treated them this way truly deserved their sacrifice. But they stayed. They continued training. They continued waiting. Because the alternative was worse, to walk away would be to accept the judgment placed on them. To fail would not be remembered as failure, it would be remembered as confirmation. By October 1944, the truth was undeniable. The 761st had been combat-ready for more than a year. They were not waiting because the army had changed its mind. They were waiting because the army had not been forced to. What finally sent them to war was not justice, it was necessity. By the fall of 1944, American armored units were bleeding men and machines across France. Losses were heavy, Replacements were scarce, and one commander, more than any other, needed tanks and crews immediately. General George S. Patton did not deploy the 761st because he believed in racial equality. He deployed them because he needed tanks, and the moment necessity overruled prejudice, the Black Panthers finally got their chance to fight the war they had been preparing for all along. Patton's pragmatic decision, November 1944. By the fall of 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army was running out of time and running out of tanks. The dash across France after the Normandy breakout had been spectacular, but speed came at a cost. Sherman tanks wore out engines faster than depots could replace them. Crews were lost to combat, exhaustion, and mechanical failure. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of liberated territory. Replacement units arrived slowly, often incomplete, sometimes poorly trained. Patton needed armored units now, not promises for later. In this situation, ideology mattered far less than results. Whatever his personal views on race, and they were complicated and often ugly, Patton was brutally consistent about one thing: combat effectiveness. If a unit could fight, he would use it. If it couldn't, he would discard it. And the 761st Tank Battalion could fight. They were fully trained, they were fully equipped. They had been ready longer than most of the units already at the front. The decision to deploy them was not progressive social policy. It was military necessity. The battalion arrived in France in October 1944 and began assembling in formation in early November. For many of the men, this was the moment they had imagined and doubted through 2 years of waiting. Europe smelled different. The air was colder. The roads were crowded with wrecked vehicles, refugees, and marching columns heading east. Soon after their arrival, Patton addressed the battalion directly. There are multiple versions of what he said, recorded years later in memoirs, interviews, and unit histories. The exact wording shifts depending on who remembered it and when, but the substance of the message never changes. Patton did not praise their perseverance. He did not acknowledge segregation. He did not promise fairness or recognition. He told them, in essence, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." It was not a speech about equality. It was a contract. Patton was offering them what the army had denied them for 2 years, the chance to prove themselves under fire. In return, he expected results. No excuses, no special treatment, no margin for failure. For the men of the 761, that was enough. They did not need validation. They did not need reassurance. They needed a battlefield. The assignment they received reflected both trust and indifference. The 761st would not be attached permanently to a single division. Instead, they would be parceled out where Third Army needed armored support most urgently. This meant constant movement, constant engagement, and almost no rest. Divisional tank units rotated off the line periodically. Independent battalions like the 761 Saint did not. It was a brutal arrangement. It guaranteed heavy casualties and sustained pressure. But it was also exactly what they had trained for: adaptability, endurance, and fighting without relief. When Patton finished speaking, there was no ceremony. The Sherman tanks roared to life. Engines coughed, then settled into their familiar rumble. Tracks clanked against French roads scarred by war. One by one, the columns moved out, heading east toward the sound of artillery. Their destination was Morville-les-Vicq. There, the Black Panthers would face their first test, not in training, not in theory, but under live fire against a German army that had already destroyed careless tank crews many times before. After 2 years of waiting, the Second War was finally about to begin. Morville-les-Vicq, combat reality. The 761st Tank Battalion's first major engagement came in mid-November 1944, near the village of Morville-les-Vic in the Lorraine region of eastern France. It was not the kind of battlefield anyone would have chosen for a debut. Cold rain had fallen for days, soaking the ground until fields became shallow swamps. Roads that looked solid on maps dissolved into mud under the weight of 30-ton Sherman tanks. Fog clung to the low ground, swallowing landmarks and reducing visibility to a few dozen yards at best. Crews could hear engines and gunfire long before they could see where it came from. This was not a retreating enemy running for the Rhine. German forces in Lorraine were falling back, but they were doing so methodically. Their crews were experienced. Their defensive positions were prepared. Anti-tank guns were hidden along likely avenues of approach, sighted to fire at close range, where even a Sherman's frontal armor offered little comfort. Artillery observers waited patiently for columns to reveal themselves. When German artillery finally found the advancing American column, the war the men of the 761 Saint had studied for 2 years suddenly became something else entirely. Shells slammed into the ground with hollow, concussive thuds, throwing up fountains of freezing mud and jagged steel fragments. Shrapnel rattled against tank hulls like handfuls of gravel thrown at sheet metal. Infantrymen hugged the ground as machine gun fire swept across hedgerows and open fields. Inside the tanks, the noise was overwhelming. Engines roared, radios crackled with half-heard orders. The smell of cordite and oil mixed with damp clothing and sweat. Training manuals no longer mattered. There was no time to debate doctrine. The men of the 761 faced the same choice every armored unit faces in its first real fight. Slow down, take cover, try to regain control, and risk losing momentum under enemy fire. Or push forward, accept the danger, and trust that training would carry them through. They pushed forward. Tank commanders stayed exposed in their hatches despite incoming fire, scanning through fog and smoke, shouting directions to drivers who could barely see 10 yards ahead. Gunners traversed their turrets toward muzzle flashes and suspected positions, firing high explosive rounds that detonated with sharp flashes in the mist. Coaxial and bow machine guns hammered hedgerows and tree lines where German infantry might be hiding. Drivers fought the ground as much as the enemy. Tracks spun uselessly in thick mud. Engines strained. A moment of hesitation could mean becoming immobilized, an easy target for anti-tank fire. Crews learned quickly when to power through and when to back out before it was too late. What mattered most was coordination. The tanks did not advance alone. Infantry moved with them, using the armored hulls as moving cover, pointing out threats that tank optics could not see. Tank crews suppressed enemy positions so infantry could maneuver. Orders were shouted, repeated, misunderstood, clarified, and acted on, all under fire. This was combined arms warfare as it was meant to be practiced, not on a range in Texas, but in mud and blood. The German defenders used the terrain well. Anti-tank guns fired from concealed positions, forcing sudden evasive maneuvers. Small counterattacks probed for weak points, trying to separate tanks from their infantry support. At moments, the advance slowed to a crawl, balanced on the edge between progress and disaster. But the 761st did not break formation. They adjusted. They covered each other. They kept moving. By the time the fighting around Morville-les-Vic subsided, the battalion had secured its assigned objectives. No sweeping victory was announced. No dramatic breakthrough was declared. But the mission was accomplished. And something else had changed. The white infantry units fighting alongside the 761st had watched them under fire. They had seen tank commanders stay exposed when it would have been safer to duck inside. They had seen gunners engage accurately in terrible conditions. They had seen tanks maneuver deliberately, not recklessly, not timidly. Quiet judgments were revised. Respect in combat is rarely spoken aloud, but it is unmistakable when it appears. The cost of that respect was real. Tanks were damaged. Men were wounded. Some crews learned, in a single afternoon, how thin the line was between survival and destruction. The romantic idea of armored warfare died quickly in the Lorraine mud. No training exercise had prepared them fully for this, but their training had prepared them enough. Morville-le-Vicq was not the most famous battle of the war. It did not appear in headlines. But for the Black Panthers, it was the moment everything changed. They were no longer a test case, they were no longer a question mark, they were a combat unit, and the war would not let them rest again for a very long time. Warren Creasy and Reuben Rivers, different forms of courage. Two men from the 761st Tank Battalion would soon stand out. Not because they were louder or more celebrated, but because the kind of courage they showed under fire took very different forms. One was sudden, instinctive, and exposed. The other was slow, deliberate, and relentless. Both mattered. Sergeant Warren G.H. Creasy's moment came during one of the battalion's November engagements in fighting that blurred together mud, fog, and enemy fire. At some point during the advance, his Sherman tank was struck by German anti-tank fire. The impact disabled the vehicle. Inside the crew compartment, the familiar sounds of combat were replaced by something more dangerous. Silence, followed by the realization that the tank could no longer move. A knocked-out tank was usually a signal to evacuate. Standard procedure was clear. Crews were trained to bail out quickly, seek cover, and regroup with friendly infantry. A stationary Sherman was an obvious target, its armor no longer a shield, but a magnet for further fire. Creasy did not follow that script. Accounts differ slightly on the details, as they often do in combat recollections, but the essential action is consistent. Instead of withdrawing, Creasy apparently seized a light machine gun, possibly taken from a nearby half-track or another disabled vehicle, and moved into an exposed firing position. From there, fully visible and without armor protection, he continued engaging German forces. This was not a calculated move in the doctrinal sense. It was a decision made in seconds, under pressure, with full awareness of how vulnerable he was. German units in the area were attempting to counterattack, probing for gaps created by disabled armor. Creasy's continued fire helped disrupt that effort. It forced the enemy to ground. It bought time, precious minutes, for American infantry and armor to reorganize and re-establish momentum. To the men watching, both inside tanks and on foot, the message was unmistakable. The fight did not end when the tank stopped moving. Creasy's action was not about heroics in the cinematic sense. It was about refusal. Refusal to accept that being hit meant being finished. Refusal to leave the field simply because doctrine said it was safer to do so. It was the kind of courage that burns bright and fast. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers represented something else entirely. Where Creasy's courage appeared in a single violent moment, Rivers' courage unfolded over days. On November 16, 1944, near the village of Guebling, Rivers' tank struck a mine. The explosion tore into the vehicle and inflicted severe injuries to his leg. The damage was obvious. He was bleeding. He was in pain. And everyone around him understood the implications. A wounded tank commander was a liability, to himself and to his platoon. Medical personnel moved to evacuate him. His commanding officer, Captain David Williams, reportedly insisted that he be sent to the rear for treatment. From any rational standpoint, this was the only acceptable decision. Rivers' injuries were serious. Infection was a real risk. Continued exposure to combat could only make things worse. Rivers refused. According to accounts from fellow soldiers, his reasoning was simple and direct. His platoon was preparing for an important attack. They needed leadership, and he intended to provide it. For the next 3 days, November 16th through November 19th, Rivers continued to command his platoon. He did so while wounded, in constant pain, likely with limited mobility and under conditions that tested even healthy men to their limits. Cold, mud, enemy fire, exhaustion. Leadership in armored warfare is not passive. A platoon leader must constantly observe, decide, communicate, and adjust. Rivers did all of this while injured, maintaining cohesion and direction during a period of intense fighting. There was no dramatic speech, no grand gesture, just presence. On November 19th, during continued operations in the same sector, German anti-tank fire struck Rivers' Sherman. This time, there was no survival. Reuben Rivers was killed. His death hit the battalion hard. Men who had followed him, trained under him, or simply watched him refuse evacuation understood exactly what had been lost. Rivers was not just a capable leader. He was proof that the battalion's standards, already impossibly high, were being met under the worst conditions imaginable. The response was not grief in the conventional sense. There was no time for that. Instead, it manifested as focus. The men of the 761st pressed harder. German positions in the area were cleared with methodical determination. Rivers' absence did not weaken the unit, it sharpened it. His example became something carried forward rather than mourned openly. But the war did not pause to acknowledge sacrifice. Even as the battalion absorbed the loss, larger events were already unfolding to the north. German forces were preparing a massive counter-offensive in Belgium, an operation that would soon be known as the Battle of the Bulge. And the Black Panthers, barely blooded, still grieving, and already exhausted, were about to be pulled into one of the most desperate and unforgiving battles of the entire war. The Ardennes, Bastogne and beyond. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive in the West. It struck without warning through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies believed was too rugged, too wooded, and too poorly supplied for a large-scale attack. In the early morning darkness, German artillery shattered the quiet. Infantry followed through snow-covered forests. Panzer units pushed hard against thinly held American lines. Within days, the front buckled. The attack created a deep bulge in the Allied lines and trapped thousands of American soldiers behind German advances. Among them was the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded in and around the Belgian town of Bastogne. Roads were cut, supplies ran low, casualties mounted. German forces moved to crush the pocket before Allied reinforcements could react. For the Americans, it was the most serious crisis in the West since Normandy. General George S. Patton received orders to respond immediately. His Third Army, which had been driving east, was now required to do something no army of its size had ever attempted under combat conditions: pivot 90 degrees north and attack into the flank of the German offensive. It had to be done fast, and it had to be done in winter. Patton needed units that could move, fight, and endure under extreme pressure. There was no time to ease inexperienced formations into the line. He called forward the battalions that had already proven they could function without rest. The 761st Tank Battalion was among them. The drive north was dangerous before a single shot was fired. The winter of 1944-45 was one of the coldest on record in Europe. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Snow piled along narrow roads, ice-coated bridges and slopes. Tanks slid off roads into ditches where recovery under fire was often impossible. Engines struggled to start in the cold. Fuel lines froze, lubricants thickened. Crews slept inside steel hulls that offered no insulation, waking to frost inside the tank. Metal surfaces became so cold that touching them with bare hands could tear skin away. Men learned to handle weapons, tools, and hatches through layers of gloves, sacrificing dexterity for survival. When the 761st reached the Bastogne sector in late December, they entered a battlefield already on the edge. Inside the perimeter, the 101st Airborne held defensive positions under constant pressure. German forces attempted repeatedly to overrun the town, aware that time was against them. Each failed attack cost the defenders strength they could not easily replace. The Black Panthers were committed to offensive action on the German flank. In early January 1945, the 761st attacked German positions near the village of Tillet, an area critical to supply routes and maneuver space around Bastogne. The terrain was unforgiving: snow-covered fields, frozen forests, limited visibility, and well-sighted enemy defenses. German forces in this sector included experienced SS Panzer units. These were not improvised formations or exhausted remnants. They were professional soldiers who did not expect aggressive American armor hitting them from an unexpected direction in the middle of winter. The fighting was intense and close. Sherman tanks advanced through snow that concealed mines and anti-tank positions. Infantry moved cautiously, using whatever cover the terrain offered. Artillery fire cracked through frozen air, its explosions sharper and louder in the cold. German counterfire came quickly and accurately. The 761st pressed the attack anyway. Their actions near Tillet helped disrupt German supply lines feeding the pressure on Bastogne. They forced German units to divert forces to defend their flanks rather than concentrate on crushing the surrounded Americans. It was not a single dramatic blow, but a series of hard, grinding engagements that slowly reduced German momentum. This was how Bastogne was relieved, not by one unit alone, but by many, attacking from different directions under appalling conditions against determined resistance. And within that larger effort, the Black Panthers played their part. There is a quiet irony in this moment. Inside Bastogne's defensive perimeter were thousands of white American soldiers, many from regions where racial segregation was law, custom, and habit. Some came from towns where Black Americans could not vote, could not eat at the same restaurants, could not serve on juries. Yet the relief they needed came, in part, from Black tankers whose service their home states might never fully honor. No one stopped to debate this at the time. Surrounded by snow, steel, and enemy fire, there was no space for ideology. What mattered was whether tanks arrived when promised, whether they fired accurately, whether they held ground under pressure. In that frozen landscape, effectiveness was the only currency that counted. The 761st did not liberate Bastogne alone. They did not receive parades. They did not receive immediate recognition. They received something else. They were used again, and again, and again. Because once an army in crisis discovers a unit that can be relied upon under the worst conditions imaginable, it does not let that unit rest. For the Black Panthers, Bastogne was not a climax. It was another step in a war that still had months to run and no intention of easing its grip. Breaking the Siegfried Line, March 1945. By March 1945, the outcome of the war in Europe was no longer in doubt. German forces were retreating on every front. Fuel was scarce. Replacements were inadequate. Allied air power dominated the skies. Yet one final barrier still stood between the Western Allies and the German interior, the Siegfried Line, known to the Germans as the West Wall. This was not a single wall, but a system. Built in the 1930s and expanded throughout the war, the Siegfried Line stretched for hundreds of miles. It was composed of thick concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, underground shelters, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and rows of reinforced concrete obstacles known as dragon's teeth, designed to halt or channel armored vehicles into kill zones. Even in 1945, it remained dangerous. German units defending the line were often understrength, but they were fighting from prepared positions. A small number of men, properly placed, could delay a much larger force. Every bunker had to be located, suppressed, and cleared. There were no shortcuts. The 761st Tank Battalion was committed to these operations as part of the broader Allied push to break through Germany's western defenses once and for all. By this stage of the war, The battalion's reputation had changed completely. They were no longer a provisional unit. They were no longer an experiment. They were a shock unit. When infantry divisions encountered defensive positions that stalled their advance, bunkers that could not be silenced, ground that could not be crossed, the 761 was often called forward. Their job was not subtle. It was direct, methodical, and dangerous. Breaking the Siegfried Line required tight coordination between reconnaissance, artillery, armor, and infantry. Recon units identified bunker locations and likely fields of fire. Artillery pounded positions to disorient defenders and collapse nearby structures. Then tanks and infantry moved forward together. The 761st's role placed them at the most exposed point of the assault. Sherman tanks advanced slowly, often at walking speed, toward known defensive positions. At close range, sometimes less than 100 yards, they fired high-explosive rounds directly into bunker embrasures, trying to suppress or kill the defenders inside. Machine guns raked firing slits and surrounding ground, preventing German infantry from emerging with anti-tank weapons. Only once the bunker's fire slackened could infantry approach. Engineers and riflemen moved in under covering fire, placing satchel charges or flamethrowers to neutralize the position. When it worked, the bunker went silent. When it didn't, the process had to be repeated, sometimes at the cost of lives. This kind of fighting favored the defender. Tanks advancing slowly across ground the enemy had prepared for years were ideal targets for anti-tank guns. Mines lay buried under rubble and frozen earth. German gunners waited patiently for tanks to expose their sides or bellies. A single well-placed shot could destroy a Sherman in seconds. But by March 1945, the men of the 761 Saint were no longer learning under fire. They trusted their infantry. They understood how German defenses were laid out. They had learned when to press forward and when to pause. Experience did not make the work safe, but it made it possible. Their contribution was part of the larger Allied effort that finally broke the Siegfried Line open. Once the system was penetrated, German defenses collapsed rapidly. Units that had clung stubbornly to concrete fortifications now found themselves outflanked, bypassed, or forced into retreat. The pace of advance accelerated dramatically. The 761st moved so quickly that, at times, they entered towns before American intelligence had current information about them. Road signs changed languages. Maps became unreliable. German resistance varied from sudden, fierce engagements to complete absence, villages abandoned almost overnight. For the first time since entering combat, momentum worked entirely in the Allies' favor. But speed did not bring relief. As the battalion pushed deeper into Austria in late April and early May, the character of the war began to shift again. The enemy was collapsing, but what the men encountered behind the lines forced a different kind of reckoning. They were approaching something no training manual had prepared them for, something that would linger long after the last shot was fired. Gunskirchen, witnessing the unthinkable. In early May 1945, as the 761st Tank Battalion operated deep inside Austria, the war began to change character once again. The first sign was not gunfire, it was a smell. Veterans would later struggle to describe it, often saying only that it was unlike anything combat had produced. Not the sharp odor of cordite, not the metallic tang of blood, not the decay left after a battlefield had gone quiet. This was something else. It reached them before they saw its source, an overwhelming stench of mass death, concentrated and sustained, hanging in the air as if the land itself were poisoned. The source was Gunskirchen, a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp system. Historically, the 71st Infantry Division is recognized as the primary liberating force when American troops entered the camp on May 5, 1945. But the 761st was operating in the same area as American forces closed in, and its soldiers were among those who encountered the reality of what lay behind the collapsing German lines. What they found defied comprehension. Inside the camp were thousands of survivors reduced to skeletal forms, men barely alive, many unable to stand, some unable even to lift their heads. Bodies were stacked against barracks and along pathways, too numerous to be buried, too frequent to be individually mourned. Sanitation did not exist. Medical care did not exist. Food barely existed. The infrastructure of the camp made its purpose unmistakable. This was not the incidental brutality of war. This was not collateral damage. This was a system. Facilities had been designed not for detention or control, but for destruction. Killing here was not chaotic or emotional. It was administrative, organized, recorded. Death was not the outcome of a battle. It was the objective of a policy. The men of the 761 Saint had seen death before. They had watched tanks burn with crews inside. They had lost friends to mines and anti-tank fire. They had killed enemy soldiers who were trying to kill them. But this was different. Veterans later recalled that battle-hardened tankers, men who had endured months of uninterrupted combat, broke down when confronted with the camp. Some wept openly. Others stood in silence, unable to process what they were seeing. The emotional armor built through combat offered no protection here. Instinct took over. They gave what they could. Rations were shared. Chocolate was handed out. Cigarettes were offered, not as luxuries, but as gestures of recognition, proof that the people in front of them were still human beings. Medical personnel quickly warned that feeding severely malnourished survivors too quickly could be fatal, and many soldiers struggled with the realization that even help could cause harm. There were no simple actions, no clean solutions. For the black soldiers of the 761, this experience carried an added weight. They had lived under a system that categorized people by race and assigned value accordingly. They had trained in an army that doubted their competence because of skin color. They had guarded enemy prisoners who were treated better in some towns than they were. Standing in Gunskirchen, they were witnessing the ultimate conclusion of an ideology that declared certain people subhuman. The scale was different. The methods were different, but the premise, the idea that identity could determine worth, was horrifyingly familiar. Years later, in recollections shared after the war, one veteran reflected that this moment clarified what they had truly been fighting against. Not just an enemy army, not just uniforms and weapons, but an ideology. An ideology that reduced human beings to categories, numbers, and disposal problems. Within days of the camp's liberation, the war in Europe officially ended. Germany surrendered. Orders filtered down. Engines went quiet. The long months of movement and combat abruptly stopped. After 183 consecutive days of frontline service, the 761st Tank Battalion stood down from active operations. They had done everything their country asked of them. They had trained without being trusted. They had fought without relief. They had bled without recognition. They had helped defeat Nazi Germany. And now, as victory celebrations spread across Europe, the Black Panthers prepared to go home, to an America that had not changed while they were gone. The war against fascism was over. The other war was not. The long wait for recognition. The ships that carried the men of the 761st Tank Battalion back across the Atlantic did not arrive to cheering crowds. There were no ticker tape parades, no newsreel cameras waiting on the docks, no headlines celebrating the Black Panthers' return. While some white combat units were welcomed home with public ceremonies and immediate recognition, the men of the 761 disembarked quietly and dispersed back into civilian life almost unnoticed. They returned to an America that looked exactly as it had when they left. Segregation was still law across much of the country. Whites-only signs still hung in public spaces. The military itself remained officially segregated. a reality that would not change until President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in 1948, 3 years after the war had ended. For some veterans, the transition home was not just disappointing, it was dangerous. There are documented cases of black veterans being harassed, assaulted, or threatened for wearing their uniforms in public, uniforms they had worn while fighting one of the most destructive wars in human history. The skills that had kept them alive in Europe offered no protection against the prejudices waiting for them at home. The message was unmistakable. Their service had been accepted, their sacrifice had been useful, their equality had not been earned. So the men did what veterans often do when recognition does not come. They went home. They found work where they could. They raised families. They carried their memories quietly. Their stories did not disappear, but they did retreat into private spaces. Living rooms, church halls, veterans' reunions, late-night conversations with people who had been there, or who knew enough to listen. The history of the 761st survived because the men themselves refused to let it die, even when official institutions showed little interest. The wait for recognition lasted 33 years. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter awarded the 761st Tank Battalion the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest unit honor the United States can bestow. The citation formally acknowledged the battalion's extraordinary gallantry and courage across months of uninterrupted combat. It was long overdue. By the time the award was presented, many of the men who had earned it were already gone. They had lived full lives, raised children and grandchildren, and died without ever hearing their country publicly affirm what they had known since 1944, that they had done their job and done it well. Individual recognition came even more slowly. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, who had refused evacuation after suffering a catastrophic leg wound and continued leading his platoon for 3 days before being killed in action on November 19, 1944, was initially recommended for the Medal of Honor. That recommendation was downgraded. Like many such cases involving black soldiers, it disappeared into bureaucracy. Rivers would not receive the nation's highest award for valor until 1997. 53 years after his death, his family accepted the Medal of Honor on his behalf from a government that had taken more than half a century to say what should have been said immediately, that his actions represented the highest ideals of military service. The delay was not accidental. It reflected a broader pattern in how valor was recognized during and after World War II. White units received immediate attention, decorations, and commemoration. Black units often received silence. Their recommendations stalled, were downgraded, or were simply ignored. The same prejudice that had kept the 761st in training while other units deployed had followed them home. History, however, has a way of resurfacing what institutions try to overlook. Today, the 761st Tank Battalion is recognized as one of the most effective armored units of World War II. Their 183 consecutive days of combat, their role from Lorraine to Bastogne to Austria, and their conduct under fire are no longer footnotes. But their story matters for more than military reasons. It reminds us that courage does not wait for fairness, that sacrifice does not guarantee gratitude, and that some of the most important battles are fought knowing the victory may never be acknowledged. The men of the 761st fought 2 wars. They won the first on the battlefield. The second, against forgetting, took far longer. And it is not finished yet. The 761st Tank Battalion's legacy isn't a story with a satisfying conclusion. They didn't come home to immediate recognition or see segregation collapse because of their service. They had to wait decades for acknowledgement, and some never received it. But they left behind something more durable than medals, irrefutable evidence that the justifications for racial discrimination were false. When given proper training, adequate equipment, and the opportunity to fight, black soldiers performed as effectively as any soldiers America fielded in World War II. The 761st demonstrated this through action at Morville-les-Vicq in the Ardennes at the Siegfried Line. They proved it at a cost measured in wounds, psychological trauma, and lives ended too soon. Their 183 consecutive days of combat, their participation in major campaigns across 4 countries, their demonstrated skill in combined arms operations, these are documented facts that no amount of prejudice can erase. But the deeper significance lies in the contradiction they lived. They fought for a country that didn't fully accept them, served in a military that segregated them, and proved their worth to a nation that took decades to acknowledge it. They did this knowing that even perfect performance might not earn them justice at home. That awareness makes their service more remarkable, not less. They couldn't force America to grant them equality, but they could make it impossible to credibly claim they lacked the courage and skill of white soldiers. Reuben Rivers fighting for 3 days with a leg wound that should have sent him to a hospital, dying while leading his men because he wouldn't abandon them. This wasn't about medals he wouldn't receive for 5 decades. Warren Creasy grabbing a machine gun and fighting from an exposed position after his tank was disabled. This wasn't political theater. These were men doing what the situation required, what their training and courage enabled them to do. The hundreds of other soldiers in the battalion, whose individual acts went unrecorded, who drove tanks through artillery fire and coordinated with infantry and maintained equipment and did all the unglamorous work that sustained operations require, they were all part of the same story. They deserved recognition as soldiers who had done their jobs exceptionally well under the hardest possible conditions. Not as a social experiment, not as a political statement about race relations, just as soldiers. That's what they had wanted from the beginning, to be judged by their performance rather than their skin color. The recognition they deserved came far too late for many of them, a final injustice that became part of their legacy. But they fought anyway. That's the true measure of the Black Panthers, not that they overcame prejudice completely, but that they proved beyond doubt that courage and competence transcend race. When Patton gave them the chance to fight in November 1944, he was making a practical decision about combat effectiveness. The men of the 761 Saint turned that chance into evidence that would eventually help demolish the foundations of military segregation. They are remembered now. Their story is taught, commemorated, acknowledged by the military that once doubted them. The recognition came late, but it came, and their service remains part of American history, available to inspire new generations facing their own struggles for recognition and justice. The 761st Tank Battalion earned their place in history the hard way, by proving their worth in combat while fighting for a country that didn't always fight for them. They earned the right to be remembered not as a footnote, but as an essential chapter in World War II and America's long journey toward equality. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon to be notified when we share more stories of courage and sacrifice from history. Share this with someone who appreciates the complexity of the past and the people who shaped it. And may God bless you, wherever you are.